It would defy imagination. And that's all recorded in your mind. And as I said, this concept of an inner I, an inner continuity, is refuted by the materialist and positivist, and we'll get to that later. But the good thing about the eigenbelt is that is the place where you have the maximum amount of responsibility, will, and free choice. It's also the center of your self-esteem. It's where you have the most dominion that you'll ever have. Because as I say, your dominion over the Umwelt is negotiable, largely quite low. As you probably know by now, your control over other people is limited and fraught with all sorts of problems. But in the inner world is where your largest focus of free will can be. Again, except if you're a neurotic person, they have trouble with that. It's also the place where you can ignore your own needs, right? It's the place you can abandon while you're absorbed in other things. Now, Edward Edinger, the psychologist, said that the self is born, but the ego is made. Because as a matter of fact, when you talk about the eigenwelt, you have to also speak in terms of, or realize that we're divided within, are we not? Kind of alluded to it earlier. But we're not a whole being within. We have the imperial self, and then we have this thing called the ego. The ego being a construct of our physical existence. In exactly the way that Freud and others have described. It's just a brain, it's just a machine that's programmed by existence. But the I, or the self, has a different type of programming, so to speak. And we jump between the two. I mean, it's a constant oscillation, a reciprocal relationship between these two. Obviously, one physical body, as I said, is much the same as another. But it's always important to point out that when we have existence, but we also know that we have existence. We have the awareness that we exist. We don't only experience existence, we are aware of it. We think, but we think about thought. And we can even think about the fact that we're thinking about thought. Now what is all this? Well, this is the miracle. These are the many rooms and facets of the inner landscape, right? The Mitwelt and the Umwelt is the external landscape. We have an entire landscape within that's under-investigated. An inner, internal environment. At a tragedy, what happens? What happens at a tragedy? Fade to grey, right? The Mitwelt and the Umwelt fade to grey, and maybe for the first time in many people's lives, and I'm hoping it's not true for everyone sitting here, but in most people's lives, for the very first time when they have a tragedy in their life, it's the only time that energy sort of retreats, and they start paying attention to this inner world, and also the question of their existence. And perhaps their relationship with time improves because of it. The eigenwelt, the consciousness of our consciousness, is the part of us that asks the important questions. It doesn't matter if other people ask them. It doesn't matter who. I don't care if it's Dostoevsky or whoever it was. It doesn't matter if it's Nietzsche or whoever. It only matters when you ask those fundamental questions. Who am I? Why do I exist? What am I doing here? We opened these points at Architects of Control in the very first statements of that program. Again, trying to anchor it in the philosophy and the psychology, because that's what's really important. Not our immersion, you see, in the whole domestic minutiae. It's important to always remember what constitutes our true humanness, or more correctly, our being. The flesh and blood stuff can be measured and calibrated. Being is vast. It cannot be so measured. Now, one other thing about eigenwelt, about you, about the inner being, is something that was brought out by several philosophers, Martin Heidegger, but especially by the French philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty. And it was something that blew the philosophical world to pieces. We're not going to go into all of the details, just want to overview what he was saying. And that is just by the very fact that you have a body, you nucleate the subject-object dichotomy, which had been plaguing philosophy and plaguing thinkers for thousands of years. Meaning that everything I'm looking at right now, including you, is considered an object of thought in the philosophical tradition, and I am the subject. Right? Ponty said, no, the whole thing is founded on a lie, because the organ of perception by which you perceive objects is subjective, isn't it? Your eye and your thinking and your act of perception is part of your subjective self. But you have a body, just like the objects of the body. And when he says body, he meant glass of water, table, everything, the object. Your body is an object of your subjective thought. So a human being's mind and the active perception nucleates the subject and object dichotomy. So without any other teachers, any other gurus, or any other techniques, even despite the fact that you may not even know this, you are already a transcendent being who has nucleated opposites. That's what you are. When you know it, it helps. So when we're running around trying to find the technique, seeking guidance from the misguided, we're it already. And one can string this out. I get into this study. It's a fascinating idea of the fact that the eye cannot see itself, but the eye is the link between the subject world and the objective world. But of course, a large part of what we're going to look at as we even wind down towards the solution section is this whole anatomy of tyranny, never forgetting to explore how Big Brother works. That will involve a deeper understanding of these relationships that we have, but it also has to do with the question of anxiety. It's fundamental. Anxiety meaning the kind of angst, fear that arises when we have these relationships. With these relationships that we have with the Umwelt and the Mitwelt and with ourselves, anxiety arises. Anxiety arises. And we have to understand a lot about that if we're going to stop slashing at the branches of evil and cut at the root. When all those pressures of the Mitwelt, all the pressures of other people causes us anxiety. Why? Because we are seeking to conform. We're asked to conform to a world we didn't really create, and maybe we don't even like. But because we need to get along, go along to get along, because it's a demand that's placed upon our heads, a tremendous amount of anxiety arises topically in the attempt to be liked and to be approved and to fit into the subscribed roles. So there's one level of anxiety from that as we interface with other people in the Mitwelt. And then, as implied in the opening statements, something else happens. In order to adjust to the Mitwelt, we don't really do it as an imperial self. We do it as a pseudo-self. So we have to don a masquerade. We play an act, a performance, a pretense, in order to adjust. So there's not only anxiety, but there's the creation of a pseudo-self, the actor. And that pseudo-self is a counterfeit self. And the ego, that which we've referred to as the ego, is basically the operating system that moves, is the engine behind that. Now, that doesn't mean that you blame the ego. The ego is just doing what it's instructed to do. It's just doing what it's instructed to do. And blaming it and cursing it is pure hogwash, and it's a sign of false teachers when they tell you to denounce the ego. But you see, this pseudo-self ends up in a lot of problems, a lot of traps waiting for it. Because you may want approval, you may want to fit in, but you don't always get what you want. So now there's another kind of anxiety that arises because you're not getting the fulfillment. You don't think you're good enough. And people get profoundly disenchanted, as we know. A lot of other people may withdraw and block it out. And that's where a lot of the boredom and depression comes from, and other neurotic syndromes. They begin, some of them for people, very, very severe. Because once you've learned to depend entirely on other people for your sense of well-being, that's the whole labyrinth begins right there. When we don't get it, when we don't get what we want, we not only become depressed, we become aggressive. Right? We become anxious, yes, but we become aggressive. You think I mean aggressive only to other people? Yes. 9 times out of 10 when you talk about anger and aggression, it's always about projecting it towards other people. No, I've said many times, that's been documented umpteen times. My concern is not so much with the violence that's on record. The history books are full of it. I'm talking about the self-hatred. And we're going to get into that later on. The turning the aggression towards the self because of this schism. Right? The feeling that you don't fit in, and what we do to ourselves, and how that's then co-opted, and how this whole dynamic works. The self-accusatory and sadistic temperament, you see. This is what concerns me. But as we said, the problem of anxiety is twofold. There's all of this negative anxiety, the topical neurotic anxiety is really the term for it. And then there's that strange, legitimate anxiety that we alluded to in the beginning. Well, what do you think that is? The other kind of anxiety that is called legitimate is the anxiety of the true self, the true imperial self, that can barely squeak, but it's there nevertheless. It's natural, it's organic, and it isn't going to die. It doesn't die, it doesn't perish. You can be incarcerated and put in a box and put in a box and put in a box, but it never dies. And that force is in constant resistance to all that claptrap and all that hogwash. And it meets the resistance from the subconscious that doesn't want that authentic voice, right, to be heard. And that's the legitimate anxiety. The legitimate anxiety of a force that feels overwhelmed by the lie. And everybody sitting in this room has been victimized by that, quote unquote. And it's good that you have been, because you wouldn't be sitting here otherwise. Because the inner self, the imperial self, knows full well that it's under attack. And there's another kind of anxiety, the legitimate, positive kind of anxiety that arises. And if you leave this room and only grasp from this talk this one principle, it will really affect your life deeply. And you'll see why as we proceed, why it's so overwhelmingly important. Now, this legitimate anxiety is intimately connected to what? Life and death. Am I wrong? What did you experience when you came out of the womb? What does every Freudian, every doctor know? That the child experiences overwhelming waves of anxiety by what? Being born. Well, that's legitimate anxiety because you took birth, and with it, walking side by side with you, as you entered this world, right? Something was walking with you. And when you go through a mini-death, which leads to a new birth, does it not? Because we don't just die once and are born once. My God, this can happen umpteen times in your life. That anxiety is going to be there. At every moment of a death and a rebirth, just like at the first birth, physically, it will be attended by this anxiety. It can never be any other way. They're known as the rites of passage, obviously. So, you see what? It's a simple equation then. To try and terminate, to try and sedate your anxiety, this positive kind of anxiety, is to do what? Is to turn off the switches of life. To turn off the very act of being born and dying and experiencing rebirth again, which we're meant to do all through life, through these rites of passage. And these rites of passage, what do they do? It's been described by so many different people. I just describe it very simply, in that there are changes in the way of seeing. For some people, that way of seeing narrows, heartbreaks, pains, death, job loss, illness. For others, a rite of passage can be a broadening. Actually, for most of it, it's both. It's an ebb and a flow. The change is obviously not just one way. It's a way of seeing that is undergoing the change. And again, that's very positive. These are the moments of agony and ecstasy. But they will be attended by this anxiety, as we said. Rollo May, he says that more than 3 decades ago, Freud singled out anxiety as the crucial problem of emotional and behavioral disorders. Further development of psychoanalysis has only substantiated his proposition, until it is now recognized on all sides that anxiety is the fundamental phenomena of neurosis, or in Horney's term, the dynamic center of neurosis. But not only in psychopathology, in the actions of normal people as well as abnormal, it is now recognized that anxiety is much more prevalent than was suspected several decades ago. From the viewpoint of dynamic psychology, Simmons accurately notes that it would surprise most persons to realize how much of their behavior is motivated by a desire to escape anxiety by either reducing it or disguising it in one way or another. Nietzsche talked about the rites of passage. He said, man is the only being who must constantly overcome himself in order to exist. So there's 2 kinds of neurosis. I don't fit in. I don't like myself because I don't fit in. That's the neurotic kind. And we want to disown the self that doesn't fit in. Then we have the other kind of legitimate anxiety from the true self, because it's not going anywhere. It's born of nature. It's eternal. It's not going to shut up and go away. At birth, each human being inherits the objective, sensual world that is shared by strangers, animals, and all physical objects. In addition to the world outside of himself, the human being is aware of an inner world. It is this awareness that makes the human being unique in the universe. The existence of two separate worlds inevitably makes us feel divided. We suffer anxiety by way of our attempts to find a balance between the two worlds in which we have to live. Well, now that we've sketched out these three realms, three facets of humanity, and a little bit about the three different kinds of relationships, we understand that the main focus of attack upon or by the architects of control is primarily on the Eigenwelt. It's not that they don't, obviously as we know, unleash their violent acts right on the Umwelt, that look at the destruction of nature, the ecocide. It's not that they don't destabilize us racially and culturally and in all sorts of other ways in the social sphere, but they reserve their finest weapons. And this is the sum total of everything my work is all about, is trying to put up periscope finally on this concept of how they focused their greatest weaponry on the psyche, on the Eigenwelt. That is the main target for these individuals. So they say, you don't need to worry about what you are. You just wait for us to tell you what you are. You won't have any anxiety if you just sit back and let us do all the work. Let the collective determine. Let other people determine. When in fact, who you are should never be determined by what you do. It should be absolutely determined by who you are. But time and time again, we throw ourselves open to the influence of others. Now, authorities such as parents, teachers, priests and experts, instructors, psychologists, and so on, have a great deal of influence on how we exist in the objective world, the Umwelt and Midwelt. They should have less of an influence on how we choose to exist within ourselves. The architects of control seek to effect subtle changes on the Eigenwelt. It is this influence that must be guarded against. The architects of control have a head start on us because their influence is already working through the efforts of our parents, whose minds are already largely colonized and infected. Their influence forces us to accept and participate in the insanity of normalcy. Now, Ayn Rand says that we are fast approaching the stage of the ultimate inversion. Right? Remember that attack, the focus of the attack? The stage where the government is free to do anything it pleases, while the citizens may act only by permission, which is the stage of the darkest periods of human history, the stage of rule by brute force. I've often talked about a second fall, you know, that the myths are, some of the greatest myths are yet to happen. What do I mean by some statement like that? Well, it's because if in fact we lose the Eigenwelt, right? If it gets eroded as it is getting eroded, don't you see that we already lose the world? If you lose the Eigenwelt, you lose the Midwelt and the Umwelt. So it's all taken care of. And the soul is lost. This is the message that the neurotics and psychotics never get. They're trying to adjust to the Midwelt and the Umwelt, right? And sacrificing and disowning and dividing and fragmenting and hating the self, not realizing they're going to lose the very thing they were seeking. It's like the serpent eating its own tail. You can't win. And Wilhelm Reich said that we're barely understanding the awful deviation and pathological degeneration of the human animal. Now, one could also say that there's another kind of legitimate anxiety, and that's the anxiety of that, yes, you should feel anxious when you're doing damage to yourself, right? So in many ways we can understand it, not lament it. If you're doing something so atrocious to your own psychology, your own psyche, perhaps you should be in a state of panic. If you're prostituting yourself to the world and to other people. And this is the ruse of the controllers, is it not? This is why they're 3 steps ahead of us, literally creating doses of this manufactured anxiety. It's the focus of their attack. H.L. Mencken said, the whole aim of practical politics is to keep the populace alarmed and thus clamorous to be led to safety. By menacing it, with an endless series of hobgoblins, all of them imaginary. And here's the clincher. Barrages and barrages of the topical kind of anxiety, or the stress that cause the topical anxiety, right? Pressures from all the other misguided people asking us to come and join us, belong, come over here, it's wonderful. And we're feeling all stressed out and anxious, right? And the media pouring all of this out on a daily basis, as we know has been going on for decades. Why are they doing this? Because they know that the more they step up this anxiety, the topical kind, or the neurotic anxiety, the more we will seek alleviation from it. And in one way, you can say, but that's a good thing. It's not necessarily great to be going around with all the anxiety. But what is Big Brother hoping for? They're hoping for, their focus is not on that. They're working on upgrading and overwhelming us. Because they know that when we go for the bromide, when we go to be sedated, when we go to be tranquilized, what goes with it? The legitimate anxiety that keeps us alive, the legitimate anxiety that is the source of all life, goes out with it. And that is Human 2.0. And that is why all of this media chaos is going. Because they know it's a trick, that when you go for the sedation, without even wanting it, without even knowing it, you're throwing out the most precious thing that exists. The legitimate anxiety goes into the trash along with the neurotic kind, and then you are left mutilated within. Job done. You know, Mark Twain said, when we realize that the whole world is mad, all the mysteries of life stand explained. I can't think of a better quote. Arnold Gruen called it the insanity of normality. And we don't have sanity. We probably never even have. What we have is pseudo-sanity, the adjustment to insanity and madness. Why not? We're trying to adjust to something that's never going to stay static. Do you think that our adjustment to the Mitwelt stays static? The Mitwelt is changing historically. It's always changing. So where are we going to find? It's like building your house in the shadow of a tree. How can you never be non-anxious, you see, in this type of interactivity? It's impossible. But these controllers love neurotics. They hate sanity. In fact, the sane person is under attack. Thomas Zaz, some psychologist, R.D. Lang, these people have pointed out how the sane man is literally under attack 24/7. He's their worst threat. And they want to incarcerate you. Sometimes they used to do it physically. They still do. There's horror stories of the terms that they use and the categorization of the power trips to incarcerate and lock people up who are sane under the title of insanity and schizophrenia. These categorizations that they've concocted. To take care of you when you start thinking beyond outside the box. Lang himself said insanity is a perfectly natural adjustment to a totally unnatural and negative environment. From the alienated starting point of our pseudo-sanity, he says, everything is equivocal. Our sanity is not true sanity. Their madness isn't true madness. And our normal adjusted state is too often the abdication of ecstasy. The betrayal of our true potentialities. That many of us are only too successful in acquiring a false self to adapt to false realities. We're being made in the shape of dead people. People with an abscess at the center of their being. And they want to turn us into what they are. Eric Fromm says, in fact, it is the fully sane person who feels isolated in the insane society. And he may suffer so much from the incapacity to communicate that it is he who becomes psychotic. Arnold Gruen says, he's a psychologist, American psychologist, he says the people who strike us as the most disturbed, the schizophrenics, are the most radical opponents of this type of identification, for they attempt to withdraw completely from our world. They are accordingly regarded as dissociated. See, they won't buy into the lie. A schizophrenic, he looks through you. He knows your power games. He knows your dynamics. He knows what it's all about. He's been having it since he was a child. And he opts out mentally, because he's going to say, I'm going to be immune in here. I will still be free inside my mind. You won't take that away from me, when everything else has been compromised and prostituted. Fromm goes on to say, the reasons why social scientists have not considered the question of the optimal social conditions for man's growth a matter of primary concern can easily be discerned if one recognizes the sad fact that, with a few outstanding exceptions, social scientists are essentially apologists for and not critics of the existing social system. They don't want to fix you. They want to put earrings on the Mona Lisa. Move the furniture around on the Titanic. Fix what isn't broken. Oh, Dr. Frankenstein's monster's depressed. We'll make him a female monster. He's happy now, right? He got what he wants. One obscenity replaces another. So these architects are working. Tomorrow's global village is basically the resort for that gutted, emaciated, right, mutilated being who's already thrown out both the neurotic anxiety and the legitimate anxiety. What do I do now? Well, it's Demolition Man, Judge Dredd time. Again, what do we call them? Collectivists, Prometheans, communitarians, utopians, Luciferians, Adventists? Their agenda was the ultimate closed society. It used to be called the Campaign for World Government. Now it's the World Federalist Movement. It's nothing more than neo-feudalism, making us slaves and serfs again, indentured vassals, and we go for it. Because they're so desperate for an overlord. It's Max Weber, the sociologist, called it the iron cage of bureaucracy. You may not get an external mark, but it's certainly incarceration nevertheless. You're mutual now. They'll take care of you. One of the terms for this type of globalism and the agenda is coined by the French philosopher Michel Foucault. It's total institution. Look it up. Very interesting reading.